Steve King, Republican of Iowa, sits on the Judiciary and Agriculture Committees, here to talk about immigration. So, sir, why do you oppose President Obama's decision to act on immigration?
Because I took an oath to uphold the Constitution, too, as did he. And the President knows that his acts are unconstitutional. He doesn't have the legal authority to simply rewrite immigration law. I sit on the Judiciary Committee, as you mentioned. I sat on the Judiciary Committee for 6 years in the Iowa Senate as well. So 18 years of that, taking an oath to uphold the Constitution, and understanding this, that back in 1986, when Ronald Reagan signed the Amnesty Act, I remember my frustration with that. And, of course, I'm a Reagan fan, but he let us down that time. I believe that he understood that if you reward people who have broken the law, you'll get more lawbreakers, and you will not be able to build that respect for the rule of law. But we've been trying to restore the respect for the rule of immigration law since 1986. It's been going downhill instead of uphill. This is a very heavy blow to the rule of law, and that is the center of why I oppose the President's act.
What should the Republican Party do?
Well, I'm suggesting, and we'll see what they do, but of course it's my recommendation, so that's the answer, is this, that we should do the minimum that it takes to get the President back inside the constitutional guardrails. And so I would start with this: a resolution of disapproval, a relatively low-key statement brought just to the floor of the House, because Harry Reid will block anything in the Senate, that says, we disapprove of what you've done, Mr. President. You don't have the authority to do so. Hit the whereases and the therefores that are relatively gentle language that makes the point. Have the debate on the floor, and I think every Republican can vote for that. And I think there will be some Democrats that will, at least a handful, maybe quite a lot. Second step, and then call upon the President to rescind his order. Second step would be a censure. That hasn't happened into a president in a long time. I think we ought to take that step. If we can't do that, then we have to cut off the funding to implement or enforce his unconstitutional act.
There is that discussion with the Omnibus spending bill looming and a deadline of December 11th. Republicans will be huddling today at 9 a.m. to talk about the next move. And do you try to do this, defund the immigration through the Omnibus spending bill? Will you talk before the conference today?
You know, I often don't make plans. I want to feel the mood of the room, and if there's enough gets said that I don't have to talk, I'm just fine with that. But I'm prepared to if the need arises. And I would bring it down to this. This is my message to the conference, and that is, do not ask us to vote to fund a lawless, unconstitutional act, especially one that the President has defined as a lawless, unconstitutional act. And so that means that I'll support going forward and putting the appropriations out that are essentially agreed to with the Senate, with the exception of the funding to implement or enforce the orders that he has issued. It's really that simple. Fund everything except that. And if the President then throws this country into a conflict, it's the President saying, I insist on having the funds to commit my unconstitutional act. That's a hard argument for the President to make.
Yeah, so the New York Times is reporting this morning that House Republicans are reviewing a plan by Congressman Tom Price of Georgia, who's popular among more conservative members, that offers a hybrid solution, a combination of a broad-based spending bill that would keep the government funded through September 2015 and a stopgap spending measure to pay for operations of the Department of Homeland Security, the agency with primary responsibility for carrying out Mr. Obama's immigration action. Are you a yes if that comes to the floor?
You know, I think how that comes together, there's some questions to be answered yet in that description. I think the strategy that Tom Price has brought forward and others, and before we left for Thanksgiving, I said I think this idea has merit. But how we fund the components of the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice are questions on how that language is written. And I would say let's fund everything except those departments for the full balance of the fiscal year. Then let's fund those departments for a short-term period of time. I'd suggest January 30th of 2015. It's the last business day in January. It gets the new Congress seated and it gives them a little bit of time. But even in that short-term bill, we cannot be funding the President's unlawful act. If we do that, we've essentially endorsed it with federal taxpayer dollars. And I think that would be crossing a line that would be awfully hard to get that back.
If you cannot defund it in this omnibus spending bill, then do you shut down the government?
Congress representatives would not shut down the government. We want to avoid that. I want to avoid that. I don't want to go through that fight. But if it happens, it'll be the President that does so. And if he's determined that he's going to push this fight, think about what's happened. He lost a huge election, and it was his agenda that was on the ballot. He reminded us all of that, every single one of them. He lost a huge election, and we hardly had a time to even count the ballots, and the president is out there throwing wrenches in the gears and starting fights with Congress. This is a fight with Congress that he has started. He moved the clock up to announce his executive amnesty edict, and he wants this fight. So if he brings this fight, Congress can't just simply say, okay, we'll give you what you want, Mr. President, to avoid the conflict. The Founding Fathers call upon us to use the power of the purse to restrain a president that gets outside his constitutional bounds. And if we put the dollars there and then think that somehow we can rescind those dollars by a rescissions bill or any other method, then it takes a two-thirds majority in the House and the Senate to override the president's veto. He doesn't have the money now. We can't let him have the money after December 11th.
Should you add this immigration action to the lawsuit that Republicans have already started against the president, executive action on health care?
You know, I wouldn't be against that. I would be for a separate suit, and there have already been another suit or two that have been filed. I'd like to see multiple suits going through the court. I called a meeting 2.5 years ago when the president initiated the Morton memos and then the DACA program. And out of that came a lawsuit that's working through its courts today. It seems to be more effective if we have multiple suits filed in multiple jurisdictions, that they can be consolidated and get to the Supreme Court. Standing is a question, and I'm for writing standing into this legislation that we have so that members of Congress can sue the president and not have to wonder whether the court's going to grant an opportunity to actually move that suit forward.
All right, let's get to calls. Several folks waiting to this is first in Clinton, Maryland, Democratic caller. Hi, Janice.
Hi, Greta. Good morning. Good morning, Mr. King.
Good morning, Janice.
Mr. King, you're probably one of the biggest flamethrowers up there on Capitol Hill. I must say, if the president had the immigration bill that had come out of the Senate and you guys had voted on it in the House, you can shake your head all you want to, darling. But I'll just say that there has been no cooperation. What about the two elections that we had in 2008 and again when the president was reelected? He never got any time to do anything. We're talking about a Senate that has engaged in 560-plus cloture and filibuster votes. That's why nothing's coming out of there. It's not just Mr. Reid that's responsible for that. Mr. Boehner never took that vote up on that immigration bill in the House. And if he had, it might have passed. So, you know, let's get our facts straight. Ronald Reagan dealt with 120 cloture and filibuster votes in his 8 years. This president has only gone through 6 and has already gotten past 560 plus. That's why nothing's getting done. I wish more Americans understood how the process works up there and how you all demagogue it.
Now, Janice, you have such a nice voice to end up with the word demagogue. First, you know, we're ignoring that there are about 381 bills that have been passed out of the House. A lot of them are jobs bills and economic development bills that are over in the Senate that Harry Reid hasn't taken up. And the single immigration bill that came back that's being sent to the House probably is going to be blocked if they tried to bring it up by a blue slip, meaning that the origination clause in the Constitution would block it from procedurally from being brought up in the House. But we should remember also that the president had 2 years when he had a vast majority in the House and the Senate. They didn't take up immigration. They took up Obamacare. Senator Schumer laments that to this day. So do I, by the way. And so there's ways that this can be argued both directions. And I take some of the points you make, and I return my points back to you. But I'd also point out that we passed a border security bill that was an urgent border security bill on August 1st of this year, dealing with the unaccompanied alien minors that are coming across the border, mostly from Central America, and a number of the things to secure the border and tighten things up and provide resources down there. And I had a lot to do with that language, but the president announced that he would veto that bill if it got to his desk before we even wrote the bill. So it's kind of hard to work with a president that'll promise he'll veto your legislation before you get a chance to even write the bill. But thanks for calling in, and I appreciate the tone of your voice, Janice.
Fort Wayne, Indiana. Barbara, Republican. Hi, Barbara.
Good morning.
Morning. You're on the air.
Excuse me. Thank you for taking my call. My comment is, we're not against immigration in this country. It's illegal. What is it that the people can't understand? Illegal. We are a country of immigrants. And President Obama, if he wants compromise, that means he has to compromise as well. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Congressman?
Well, thank you, Barbara. You know, I've watched in this country as it seems as though it's an intentional effort to conflate terms for political gain. And one of the ways to describe this difference between legal and illegal immigrant now has been conflated to the point where people don't always understand the difference. In conversations I'm in, I sometimes have to stop and define it. So which are we talking about here? Are we talking about illegal immigration, legal immigration, or are we talking about people who have migrated into this country in general? Another example of that language conflation would be the difference between health care and health insurance. That got pulled together, and then we saw ourselves with the National Health Care Act, partly because we weren't able to any longer articulate the difference between. But when people say anti-immigrant, and they write that a lot about me, anti-immigrant, and my secretary's on the phone most days calling up the people that write that say, you can't write that. My boss, Steve King, is not anti-immigrant. I'm very much pro-legal immigration, and I go and speak at the naturalization ceremonies whenever I can, and as often I have to pause because it means so much to me that it begins to choke me up when I think about how people dream to come here to America legally the right way. And there's something I'd add to this thing that nobody talks about, and I think we should talk about it a lot more. I'd call it an American vigor. When you think of the people who have the aspirations that when they see even a picture of the Statue of Liberty and they think, I want to go there because I can become all that I can be in the United States of America, that brings to us a natural filter process that brings the most vigorous people from the planet here to America. And that's one of the reasons for our success. And we ought to celebrate that, and it erodes that success when we have massive amounts of illegal immigration.
Daniel's next, McLean, Virginia, independent.
Hey, so I want to ask you this. Since when have you trying to argue the constitutional illegitimacy of what the president is doing? The fact of the matter is, no president throughout our history, no Congress together throughout our history, has ever fully followed the Constitution to a T. So I'm wondering, where do you get off accusing him of unconstitutionality when the fact of the matter is our country has never followed what our founding fathers tried to do with this country? We have continuously degraded the Constitution and fucked up this country, and this is why we're at where we're at now.
Well, Daniel, you just raised an argument that would never end. It could go on about every single issue ever touched or not touched by a president of the United States. So I would narrow it down to this, is that we have to take a stand at some point. It's gone beyond the limitations. Now, I've never made the argument that a president doesn't have executive order authority. I believe he does. But I would just take you back to the Constitution, the president's oath of office, and that requires him to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The president has given these speeches time and time again. I recall one here at a high school just a few miles from where we are this morning here in Washington, D.C., March 28, 2011, when he said to the class, you want me to just simply implement the DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Well, I feel the temptation, but I can't do that because I'm the president. That's Congress's job. He said my job is to enforce the laws. The Congress's job is to write the laws, and the judicial branch's job is to interpret them. That's a pretty simple analysis. The president taught constitutional law for 10 years, and I know he understands this, but the political temptation has overcome his constitutional oath to office. I don't think this is a tough call at all. I don't think it's a tough call when the president decides he's going to delay the implementation of the employer mandate on Obamacare by simply going into a written law that says, and take the year 2013, strike it out, and replace it with the year 2014. When you see that the president has said in vast classes of people, he's creating classes of people and saying you're exempt from the application of the law, when the law says to immigration agents, enforcement agents, including ICE, you shall place them into removal proceedings when you encounter them, the president orders them to break the law. That's the heart of a lawsuit that we initiated 2.5 years ago. So I don't think this is a tough call at all. And if we do not, if we fund the president and he can decide which laws are enforced and which ones aren't, aside from the individual case-by-case prosecutorial discretion, if he can do that, then Congress doesn't have any meaning at all. And that's where it stands. We must keep a balance in this constitutional republic that we have, and we have a responsibility. That's why I took my oath, and that's why 535 of us in the House and Senate took the oath. We're going to have to now enforce it.
We're talking to Representative Steve King, Republican of Iowa, about this immigration debate here in Washington. The phone lines are open. The phone lines different. So check in on your screen there. There they are. Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents 202-748-8002. The lines are open, so start dialing in. Senator Patty Murray, Democrat of Washington, made a similar argument about the president taking this action and saying the system has failed, so now it's time to act. This is a tweet that she put out. The time is for now, showing previous presidents, Republicans, acting on immigration alone, taking executive action.
Well, there's a little bit of truth in that, I would say, and that is that Ronald Reagan signed an executive order after he signed the 1986 Amnesty Act. The differences are Congress acted, and then the executive order was a method to further define the language in the law. And President Reagan's executive order that he signed affected about 150,000 people. There's been a story out here that George H.W. Bush signed an executive order that affected 1.5 million people. And when I read back through that, that happens to be one writer's fairly wild estimate that was never supported by any real kind of analysis. So there's a difference here. When a president acts to tighten down the language or further refine the language of existing law after Congress has acted, that is one thing. But when the president says, Congress, I told you to pass this law and you didn't, and now I'm going to punish you or I'm going to take your authority over, what the president has really done in this case is that he has taken the Constitution, this Constitution essentially, and separated out Article 1 in the Constitution, and then he's essentially stood up on that Thursday, Article 1 of the Constitution, which grants the legislative authority to the United States Congress, torn that out, looked at it and said, this is mine too. Tucked it in his shirt pocket. That's the effect of the president acting unilaterally. Well,
the Obama administration, as you know, disagrees, and Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson, a lawyer, sat down, according to the New York Times, for hours with the president trying to look at where they thought they had legal ground on this. He's going to be testifying today up on Capitol Hill before the Homeland Security Committee, their Immigration and Border Security. We're going to have coverage of that, 9 a.m. Eastern Time on C-SPAN 3. The Washington Times has a preview of his testimony, and they report this, that Mr. Johnson, in prepared testimony, said granting tentative legal status to illegal immigrants with children in the country legally only recognizes the situation already in place under which his department had already decided not to deport those parents. Here's a quote. Many of these individuals have committed no crimes and are not enforcement priorities. It is time that we acknowledge this as a matter of official policy and encourage eligible individuals to come out of the shadows, submit to criminal and national security background checks, and be held accountable.
Well, most of this language we have heard before. And if I were sitting on the Homeland Security Committee, I would be very eagerly prepared for this testimony this morning. And I would sure like it if Secretary Johnson would also come before the House Judiciary Committee, where you actually have constitutional lawyers seated there and people who are steeped in the Constitution and the rule of law. And I would point out to Secretary Johnson that I have read the Office of Legal Counsel's 33-page legal document, the recommendation that was delivered to the President, I presume to Jay Johnson and others, as their guideline on how they could do this that they wanted to do and how they could do that and couch it as legally. There are a number of places in there that essentially say no, and they had to turn around and redefine. So I did this little thing. I did a word search in the 33-page document. And I searched for the key words that would be the excuse words, the get out of jail free words, the case-by-case basis, discretion, individual basis only. I searched those 3 words. They used those words in 33 pages 152 times. 152 times, which tells me they expect this to be litigated. They're preparing to go to court, and they're preparing to point to those words that say case-by-case, prosecutorial discretion. But you cannot have prosecutorial discretion on groups of people or classes of people, and that's what they've created, and that's what the argument will turn on. And in the end, they'll either lose, or we'll have a president who can simply wipe out constitutional authority whenever he thinks he can define it.
All right, back to calls. On our line for Republicans, John in Cincinnati, Ohio. Go ahead, John.
Hi, Representative King and Greta. You do a great job.
John.
It is positively Orwellian the way the president can say he cannot take this action repeatedly, and then he takes that action. Or they say that people who are here illegally have not broken a law. It's amazing. I really liked your points, though, about the vigor of the type of citizens. You know, we are a nation of immigrants, but we are not the nation we were in, 17.
Accomplish that than it is to just shut off the funding. That takes 2/3 to get that accomplished in the House and in the Senate. So the easy way is 218 votes in the House that cuts off the funding.
Okay, we'll go to Minnesota. Larry's watching us there, St. Stephen, Minnesota, an independent. Hi, Larry.
Good morning, Mr. King. How are
Morning,
you
Larry.
today?
I am doing fine.
Okay, I got a couple of questions for you. About how many meat packing plants do you have in Iowa?
I should be able to answer that question. I could probably count them up. I've been in many of them. There are quite a few, though. And pork and beef and also turkey processing in Iowa. Quite a lot. I don't know the number.
What's your point, Larry?
So you probably have quite a few, call it shareholders and stockholders in these companies also, don't you, in Iowa?
Well, I would expect that to start to look through a list in my mind's eye. I can't come up with many.
I remember, Iowa seems to be really, really white in color as far as the color of people's skin. Am I not correct?
I think that would be statistically true. You could look at the U.S. Census and confirm that, Larry.
Here's the problem. Iowa is a lawless state because you've got a total conspiracy between owners and their stockholders to screw the United States government out of tax money. I think Eric Holder ought to take a really good look at you and your state, because there's a lot of people in your state that seems to be what I would call lawbreakers. We've got them in Minnesota. All you got to do is go by the packing plants.
Are you talking about who they hire, Larry?
You cannot be that blind as to not know what's going on in your own state.
Okay, Congressman.
I don't know that there's a connect or a disconnect in your point, Larry, about lawbreakers. If you're talking about some of the employees, I don't think there's any doubt about that. There are a good number of employees working in our packing plants that appear to be illegal, working illegally. And the technicality of the enforcement of the law, I'm not going to defend the people that hire and employ illegals. But what I do is I try to bring policy to the nation. If I decided that I was going to, say, focus on a single packing plant in Iowa and do my best to use all the leverage of this Congress to try to clean up a single packing plant, I may or may not succeed at that, but I wouldn't be succeeding at a national policy. So I try to look at the national policy, and I think if you look at each bill that I've offered has moved things in that direction. And I do want a tighter labor supply, as I said a little bit earlier. I remember what it was like when these plants were built. I walked through Iowa Beef Packers, the original beef plant in America, in 1961, before there was ever a critter hanging on the hook. I remember that some of my classmates aspired to be luggers at the beef plant. They had an opportunity to build a pretty nice house doing labor work in plants. Now, the oversupply of low-skilled labor has driven wages to the point where that's no longer an opportunity. I want a tighter labor supply, and I want to follow the law. I appreciate your call. Thanks, Larry.
On our line for Republicans, George, Hudson, Florida.
Good morning. How are you today?
Morning, George.
Morning, George.
Hi. That's funny. I'm sitting here listening to these phone calls, and it seems like I'm swimming in a sea of stupidity. Some of these callers are just crazy. My question is, what are we going to do about these orders that Obama, our worst president ever in America, when Obama is out of office, we get a good president in there. How are we going to turn these orders around? What are we going to do without finding some type of landmine in them, where it's going to screw the Republican that succeeds him? What are we going to do to get us on the right course?
Okay, George.
Well, we've got a couple of years to work that out, and I'll be doing my best to have conversations with these presidential candidates as they hopefully come to Iowa. But I'm just thinking that a new president, by the time he swears in on January 20th of 2017, will have had his staff go through every single executive action on the part of the President Obama over 8 years. And I would expect that there would be a very early announcement that there would be many executive orders that would be rescinded on the first day. That would be my recommendation. Anything that's done by executive action can be rescinded immediately, and that'll happen in a lot of cases. Then we have the situation with Obamacare. I have worked for a long time to, well, first to defeat it and then to repeal it. And I'm going to continue that effort in this new Congress, and we'll hopefully lay that foundation. So let's see how this plays out. It's a long ways into the future. And I will say this, there's a really good field of presidential candidates that are emerging, and I'm impressed with many of them.
Including Jeb Bush, the Florida governor?
I would include all of the impressive Republican candidates. And it does include Jeb Bush. You know, he comes from 3 or more generations of stellar people. And I think that the ideals that come on each of these candidates need to be tested in the marketplace, that marketplace of ideas. Let them compete with each other. And you can take the presidential candidate, the raw material of the presidential candidates as they are today, pull them out of their law office or off their tractor or wherever they might come from, and set them down in the Oval Office down the street here. They might be a good president, but they won't be near the president. They will be after they go through the nomination process and the general election process. It takes that good raw material candidate and develops them into an excellent president. So that test is really important, and I want to help and assist with that test of that competition of ideas, ideals, and how do their ideas resonate across America. That's the biggest thing we've got ahead for us, and it's a long future to look into. But let's fight it out, and in the end, we get to find out what the American people think, and they get to learn from the candidates, and it forces us into a conversation that we need to have as a nation. What is the next destiny for America? Will it be an ascending destiny, or will it be our current descending destiny, which I believe we're on now?
Do you have a front runner or a couple of front runners?
At this point, no. I'm encouraging an open field, and let's have this competition of ideas. But there are about 5 or 6 names I would put into a hat and draw one out and say, I'm happy with this one now.
Okay. Steve in Livingston, Texas, independent caller. Hi, Steve.
Hi. Hey, look, I live down here in Texas where we really have a whole lot of illegals. And, you know, the problem down here, man, is that there are people who are working, you know, 50, 60, 80 people. They're paying them about $15 an hour or less for a job that pays around $30 an hour. So why is it that we don't prosecute the people who employ the illegals? And within 90 days, if those people believe that they're going to be fined or put in jail, all these young men in America, young American men, would be out there working, making $30 an hour where they can make a living. We can't live 9, 12, 15 people in a motel room. My wife's not going to accept that.
Okay, all right. So Steve in Texas.
You're right on this, and I would take you back to '86 again when out came the I-9 form. And that was the form, if anybody came in and applied for a job, you had to maintain the I-9 form. And that form required that you review the documents that would identify the individuals, and it at least implied that the employer had to make a judgment call on whether the individual was legal or not. It implied that. And the ACLU and others have taken that to court time and time again, and the courts have finally come down to you can't require an employer to make a judgment call. And so if there are documents there that could be presumed to be legal on their face, whether or not they identify the individual that's applying for the job, that's generally enough so that the employer is not prosecuted for hiring illegals. And when there is a raid into a factory that can bring about this kind of punishment, and I can think of a few of them that we've had, there's been such a pushback on this that essentially this administration, for that and other reasons, have decided they're not going to enforce the law anymore. So that's why I brought the legislation that I mentioned earlier in the program, the New IDEA Act, that brings the IRS into this. And if we could do so, if we could clarify that wages and benefits paid to illegals are not tax deductible, then, and if the IRS came in to enforce, and there's a 6-year statute of limitations, so you accumulate that liability over a period of 6 years, that would have a tremendous impact, because you never know when the IRS is going to show up at your door. You'd have 6 years to wonder, and I think that would have a lot to do with it. But we need to shut down the jobs magnet. That's the heart of what you're saying. Tighten up this labor supply. There's not any such thing as work that Americans won't do. Not when you have that are rooting terrorists out of Fallujah for about $8.09 an hour. There isn't any job Americans won't do. You just have to pay them the going rate. And when you have 80 different means-tested federal welfare programs, that essentially is the incentive, the disincentive for people to work. So we need to work that both directions, and we need to work it incrementally. And I'm hopeful we'll be able to do this in the next Congress, and certainly I'm hopeful we can with the next president.
We'll go to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. William is watching us there, Republican. Hi, William.
Good morning, and good morning, Representative King, and thank you for your integrity in Congress.
Thank you.
My question is a little bit larger than the immigration issue. It goes to the power of the presidency. Back when George Washington was the first president, there were probably, I think, 14 or 15 different agencies that he had control of. Today, the president has control of thousands of agencies and billions of dollars, and there seems to be no oversight over what he can do, and he can change basically the laws by changing the regulations, which he puts out every week. Changes in regulations. Is there any way that Congress can have greater oversight for each individual agency that can prevent the president from doing things that are against the will of the people?
Yes, it is a big question. And over the years, what has happened is Congress has decided incrementally that they didn't want to take the responsibility for the details of the federal government. So they granted a rules process that allows the agencies to publish rules through the Administrative Procedures Act and have them up for review, a comment period, and then they have the force and effect of law. That's what we're dealing with. Some number approaching 3,500 of them were released just going into the Thanksgiving weekend. How do you combat that is your question, and that's at least a piece of it. And I've looked at this for a long time, devised a method to this. There's a bill that the House has passed called the REINS Act, and it's a good bill that says any rule that has more than $100 million impact has to come before Congress for an affirmative vote before it can have the force or effect of law. That's a good step, but it doesn't go backwards. Everything is grandfathered in, and it only deals with those that are $100 million or more. And so I had, before that bill was brought forward, I had written a bill, still have it, and what it does is it requires all rules to come back before Congress inside of 10 years. No rule can last longer than 10 years. They automatically sunset at 10 years period of time. Each agency is required to bring a minimum of 10% of its rules before Congress for an affirmative vote each year for 10 years. So all rules are reviewed. And yes, it would be a little messy and kind of a burden for Congress to evaluate all of that, but it would give us an opportunity then to amend the rules or simply strike them down and to clean up the rules process. And each one of us would then, every member of Congress, House and Senate, would be in a position where we were responsible for all of the rules that the executive branch lives under. If we took that responsibility back to Congress, it would be a very hard bill to pass. If we did that, that would clean up a lot of it by putting the accountability back on Congress where it does belong. And you have really identified a very big problem that this growing federal government has.
On the politics of this is from USA Today. For Democrats, Hispanics are close to a lock. And Alan Gomez reports that there are very few times in history when an entire segment of the population suddenly lines up behind one party. African Americans were split until President Truman desegregated the military. Then they started flocking to his party. After President Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act, African Americans have voted overwhelmingly for Democratic Party. There's no question that Hispanics already lean Democratic, but they've never approached the overwhelming support of African Americans who have hovered around 90% support for Democrats for decades. But Alan Gomez reports that Democrats could get close to that number because of the actions the party has taken versus what the Republicans are saying. Are you concerned?
Well, I'm concerned about the advice I get on how to solve this problem, and it comes from people that seem to have no idea how to address the African American vote as a Republican. If the strategists in the Republican Party insist that we must pass amnesty if we're ever going to be a party that can recruit large, significant numbers of Hispanics, if that's their argument, my answer back to them is, what's your plan for the African American vote? I think we have a lot to offer, I'd say also though that this movement of the Hispanic vote, we should really look at it a little more closely. George Bush, some claim, got 44% of the Hispanic vote in 2004. That was an effort that was concentrated on reaching out to the Hispanic vote. And if you analyze that, it really was more like 39% of the vote, not 44%. But if President Bush got 39% of the Hispanic vote in 2004, John McCain got 31% in 2008. That's an 8% drop in the Hispanic vote when you had an open borders presidential candidate in John McCain. He still lost a larger percentage of that.
Well, he didn't talk like that while he was running, though.
Well, but people knew what his record was. We know here. And so then when Mitt Romney came in, that 31% that John McCain got dropped to 27%. You might say that Mitt Romney arrested the fall. And it's because it went from, say, 39% to 31% to 27%. Now, if you look at the elections in Texas, where Greg Abbott got 42% of the Hispanic vote, the lieutenant governor got 44% of the Hispanic vote, and that was on a strong rule of law, border security agenda for both of them. I say that the Hispanic vote, a lot of the Hispanic vote, is going to reflect the values like all of the rest of America. And we should not be doing identity politics in this country. It divides on the lines of race, ethnicity, national origin, pits Americans against Americans. It is immoral to gain your political power base and ground by telling one group of people that the other group of people hates you. And by the way, Democrats are losing the white vote at a pace about the same pace that they are picking up the Hispanic vote. And they'll be accountable for that someday too, but it divides America, and I don't want to see this. I want to see America that's a completely integrated America, and one where we pull together for the same cause, having a common history, a common language, a common set of aspirations for everybody in this country.
Well, this conversation over President Obama's decision to act on immigration continues this morning up on Capitol Hill, where the Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson will be testifying. We will have coverage of that on C-SPAN 3 at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Congressman Steve King, we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks for talking to our viewers.
All my pleasure. Thank you, Greta.
Coming up.